It's good to see you here, and I'd like to now introduce Greg, who kindly agreed to an informal question and answer session. He's leaving next week to go to Adelaide, where he's a speaker at a leadership conference.
Yeah, Australian Leadership
Retreat, and then returning to Perth, and then coming back again to see us in October, I believe.
Am I?
Yeah, I believe so.
You get a free lunch.
Oh, free lunch, okay, good.
So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Greg and Pam.
Well, it's always great to be back at the Aero Club, and I'm a member here, and was many years ago as well. So it's great to come back and see that they've now graduated to tiger moths and chipmunks and things which are proper aeroplanes. But what I found in the past is that nobody wants to talk about aeroplanes here at the old Fliers group. They want to talk about what's going on in the world. So maybe if I can just kick off with a comment about which we were discussing at over lunch. I said I'd elaborate about the situation with the People's Republic of China and the situation of the Chinese Air Force, PLA Air Force, and the PLA generally, because someone made the comment they've got some pretty nifty aeroplanes these days when they fly, and that's very much the situation of the PLA overall, technologically and in terms of training. They're getting about the same number or slightly more training hours per year than US Air Force combat pilots, but they're flying these new aircraft which look very much like F-22s, F-35s and the like, stealthy looking, and the reality is that the Russians are not providing them with the new generation engines, which means that they are now committed to developing their own aero engines to actually meet the performance that the airframes are supposed to offer them. And the fact is that they are not doing very well in this regard at all. Their engines currently have a life of about 200 hours.
A bit like the MiGs.
Yeah, well, worse actually in many respects, because what are you going to do with 200 hours in a combat situation? You either have to have a lot of spare engines and so on, and those engines, by the way, are ones which are not giving optimal performance. So even though the aircrafts look good at air shows, they are not giving the required thrust that they would need to overmatch or even match most Western aircraft, whether they're F-35s or Rafales or whatever. So essentially they've got a lot of problems, and that's only the start of the problem with the PLA. PLA is now fractured, it's highly corrupt, it's highly opposed to Xi Jinping, and the result is that Xi does not trust him anymore. He'd thought he would build his power base, because he came in without a definite power base of his own in 2012, and he thought he would convert the PLA to his power base when he was chairman of the Central Military Commission. And in fact, he hasn't been able to do that, although he thought he was, by putting in his favourites as heads of the various branches and reorganising the support forces to create the strategic rocket forces and so on and so on. The reality is that his own appointees have left him disappointed, or perhaps his paranoia has taken over, and he's fired most of his own appointees, whether as foreign minister or as the defence minister and the like, imprisoned a lot of people, and this is a process which keeps on going. And for him to actually commit to any conflict, he needs the strategic rocket forces as the real guarantor of success if he was to attack Taiwan or the Philippines or the like, or wider afield, going to Guam for the Americans or Yokosuka for the 7th Fleet Northern Headquarters. So the rocket forces are absolutely not definitively under the command of Xi Jinping. Neither are the other branches of the PLA, and the point is that they've never been combat tested, and there's been a lot of corruption and a lot of siphoning off of technology, and you're worrying about the lowest bidder for parts on a space shuttle. It's even worse in the PLA because people just sort of paper them over. The Potemkin missiles, Potemkin weapons in many respects. So there's a real doubt as to the capability of the PLA. And you've got to look at Xi's record overall within the political structure as to whether he could even get the PLA to do anything that he asked them of a serious nature. He has not, since he's taken office, made one major decision which has been beneficial to either the Communist Party or to the People's Republic of China as a geopolitical entity. And he's pushed himself into corners, so he wasn't driven into these corners, he painted himself into corners on, for example, what he calls the recovery of Taiwan into the PRC. And of course Taiwan was never a part of the People's Republic of China. But he keeps saying that he's going to do this and then is unable to do it. And so they keep changing the timelines on that, and the windows of opportunity for the PRC, even assuming they had the capability, is shortening. And as the Republic of China, Taiwan, strengthens its capabilities and is more engaged with its allies, including Australia, which has reluctantly come out of the closet and given some support to Taiwan. But Japan is committed to day one being engaged in a war to support Taiwan if it's attacked by the PRC, which means that the PRC then has to maneuver essentially against South Korea and against Japan. And if it hits Yokosuka, which is the headquarters of the Japanese Navy, then they'll have to hit the US Navy, which is co-located there. I was just up there briefing the US Navy on this issue, and up in Alaska briefing the Air Force, because the US Air Force Alaska, while it's been maintaining the Alaska Air Identification Zone, is committed to supporting Guam, which is a very difficult operation because it entails quite a number of air refueling and then getting out of your Arctic survival suits once you hit the ground in Guam, and it's assuming that the Guam airfields are still intact. But the reality is that the PLA is against Xi Jinping now. Xi Jinping has bankrupted the country, and I've been talking over many years here, as a matter of fact, I think to some incredulity, that mainland China is bankrupt. They really can't sustain any operation anywhere in the world. They're putting more into defence than into any other sector other than domestic security. For all that this increases in defence spending of PRC, they're committing more to internal security. So that tells you how secure Xi Jinping is. And yet he's been pushing troops down into the Tibetan plateau to confront India, because India, as part of the Quad arrangement, is committed to supporting the defence of Taiwan. But the way it would do that would be to immediately invade the Tibetan plateau, so the PLA has been reinforcing that. But the Indians have got they had in 2019, they moved 1 million troops, almost 1 million troops, up into Jammu and Kashmir to be ready to surge into both the Tibetan plateau, which is the headwaters of all the major rivers in the region, including the Mekong and so on, and the Indus River and so on. So it's key to everything, including the survival of Pakistan. And so some of the troops would take over the Tibetan plateau. Some would surge across the Azad Kashmir, northern part of Pakistani-occupied Kashmir, and that would cut the Chinese off from a link from Xinjiang down into the Indian Ocean at Gwadar. And that would also isolate Pakistan. So none of this is necessarily good for us, but it's also disaster for Beijing. So the question now is whether Xi Jinping can keep killing off his enemies and arresting his enemies faster than they can coalesce to remove him from office, either putting him into a symbolic leadership role, or basically having him retire from some form of lead poisoning or other.
Fall out of a window.
Very good.
Yeah, fall out of a window.
Let's move along then with the question and answer. A lot of you must have particular interests, and maybe to start off with the question session.
Okay, everyone. Thank you, Greg. Thanks for the intro. I just left the Air Force after 34 years, and I was in Guam a month ago.
Oh,
so through the area a lot. I hear
yeah.
the radio calls between the PLA on the surface, on the guard frequency, and it's very immature actually, the exchanges on the radio
Yes.
that go on, swearing and calling
Yes,
names and all that. Quite embarrassing, I think, for particularly one side, but both. But when this is sort of like a side obsession of mine, as I have daughters, and many in the room will have granddaughters, so my primary concern is that this country doesn't need to end up in a conflict with such a large nation. We know what conflicts, we only need to look at Aleppo and other countries, Ukraine right now, what happens, how destructive it is. Then there I hear these terms like China's a paper tiger. That's effectively what you've just described. It looks powerful, but maybe there's nothing behind it. And then there's this fractured relationship between the PLA and the leader who appears on a global stage to be quite strong. My question really is, how do you know of this fractured relationship? Because we're not getting that through any normal sources of media. It's said to be the fact, but how do you come to know this is the case?
Well,
it's warming to hear it,
Mm-hmm.
right? But how do you know this?
Well, we've been tracking it for literally 55 years. Have been tracking this with a lot of internal sources as well, and we're looking at there's now a lot of imagery coming out of various parts of mainland China. So you see the depth of the economic decline, for one, and that's the critical aspect actually, but which makes Xi Jinping defensive, because he now has to defend himself against the CCP, Communist Party elders, and at the last, we know from leaks there that at the last Badaher conference of CCP elders, that he was told to get things under control, get the economy moving again, which is not going to happen. He was told by the elders that he had to make up with the United States and get US investment back on track, and that's why at the Pacific Forum, which was in San Francisco 6 or 8 months ago, he was told to get $2 trillion of US funding back into the system. And of course he put that to Biden, who, even if he was conscious of it and even if he could, understood he couldn't have done it physically. There's no mechanism for the US to dictate the reinvestment of US funds into the PRC. But Biden did support him as much as possible, and and the next day they had the meeting where she addressed US business leaders, and the day after the business leaders meeting with Xi Jinping, even more money was withdrawn from China, from the stock market there, and so on. So basically, Xi did nothing to reassure American investors. So that was clearly not going to happen. So since then, what we have, you can see tangibly, the PRC has been lowering its exposure to the US economy by selling off US bonds, particularly, which is not helpful to the US either. But it's all through this, the PRC has been trying to minimise its exposure to the US, and the Ukraine war was very, very, very supportive of that, because it forced Russia in the short term after the embargoes to sell its grain surpluses, and Russia has massive grain surpluses. It's one of the most productive agricultural countries in the world at this stage. So they diverted a lot of that at low price to PRC, even more to India, and the same with gas and oil and gas. So that helped lower China's exposure to the US for its essentials, for financial stability and for food, because the deal which Trump signed with the Chinese just before he left office was essentially to provide massive volumes of US grain output, and particularly soybeans, to the Chinese market. And when they did that deal, the Chinese minister who signed for the PRC said, we're actually going to need double that amount if we're to survive. And now they've lowered that exposure, so the Chinese population is getting less and less food. And it is, and I think I mentioned this here before, the most existentially exposed major power to foreign food imports of any empire since the collapse of Rome. So it's really in bad shape. Now, having said that, paper tigers are still dangerous because everyone who's had a paper cut knows that. But you're talking about instability and irrational responses, and Xi Jinping will certainly not go down without a fight. And his fight is primarily, well, you'd think it'd be primarily with the Chinese population, which is now getting back to the point of starvation. And we saw under Mao Zedong that they lost about 60 to 80 million people through starvation during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. That could happen again, but he wants to return the country to the Maoist form of internal economic circulation, which basically means being self-dependent. Well, they can never be self-dependent in regard to food, which is the primary situation. Largely, they've polluted all of the ground soil, so that's very bad for the agriculture, and that's become worse in recent years because of the rush to convert farmlands back to grain production, and they've lost a lot of their topsoil with the water management situation as well. I'm not sure you're aware that for the last 5 years or so, China has had massive flooding, largely caused by its dam building program and then its inability to have those dams withstand the high flows of some of this periodic monsoonal rainfall and the like. And so there's, every day you've got massive areas of flooding, which is then destroying cities because as the water is released from the dams to stop the dams breaking, it's flooding through cities like Wuhan, and you see the buildings and the roads and the overpasses and the like collapsing because of what they call tofu dregs construction, which is where inferior materials have been used and shoddy construction techniques have allowed and have done this as contractors to make more money. And you get areas where you've got all the drain covers and so on down the street, but there are no drains. And so as a result, whole sections of areas of the cities are collapsing, buildings collapsing and the like. So you've got widespread starvation, huge proportion of the population unemployed, particularly, and they don't even mention rural unemployed when they do their statistics, even though they lie with all of their statistics, as we're now seeing in the West as well. But the reality is that nothing you see out of China is in any shape or form reliable unless you're seeing, if you like, anecdotal evidence on the ground of all these problems. And the more robust you see Xi Jinping and some of the Chinese officials, the more bombastic and boisterous they become. It's always been a measure of their weakness rather than their strength. Mm-hmm. But the question is, what can Xi Jinping do to command some kind of response from the internal security forces or the PLA? The other factor in this, which the real enemy, if you like, is, well, apart from the Chinese Communist Party elders, are the princelings. And Xi Jinping himself is a princeling, a son of a former high CCP official. And the other princelings were all basically expecting to have their share of the pie and inherit their parents' corruption networks and the like, and become wealthy and the like, a bit like politicians here. But and in America, of course, and in Britain and France and everywhere. But the situation is that the princelings have been robbed by Xi Jinping, who's basically tried to cut them off, and basically he's the only one who's the beneficiary. That's how he controls the opposition, by denying them money. Anybody with cash in PRC is a potential threat to Xi Jinping. So he's isolated these various groups and therefore made them intractable enemies. The question is, how can they coalesce to remove him? And that's where we see this great period of instability, which could come to a head this year, because 2024 is a key year globally because of the US elections. The uncertainty caused by the US elections and the US election years every 4 years means that things happen around the world which the US is too busy to respond to and too preoccupied with its own issues. And that's what we're seeing more than ever before in history this year, because the US itself is largely because of the totalitarian mass movements which have a lot of support and origin in the PRC. They've been working to undermine the US and the West generally.
Well, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Oh, more than, I mean, I've listened to it for a lot.
Can we bring it a little closer to home then? Any questions? Next question.
Oh, I was just going to change tack to mention the US elections. It's something I was just listening to is the influence that artificial intelligence is having going forward. I've heard stories where they say it counts for about 20% influence now, but in 5 years' time it's going to be 80 or 90%. Do you have any intelligence on that?
Yeah. We saw this, by the way, with the last set of presidential elections in the United States in particular, and we've been seeing a gradual growth in remote access to the US communications and computing systems from various offshore players and domestic players, by the way, so that you have bots doing a lot of the work for you and automating it. Now the question of whether that translates into influence is another question. What we are seeing finally is some pushback against, for want of a bit of a political correctness, the mass psychosis which is induced by globalist mass movements. So you've got the two globalists, we've got the two mass movements, the globalists who are basically anti-national, and in various countries, Australia, Canada, US, you get the nationalist response of people saying, hang on, these people don't make sense, they're talking gibberish in the cities. So the nationalist response is largely suburban, rural, rather than deep urban, and the deep urban populations control literally everything now, especially when you've got like 87% of the Australian population urbanised and about 85% of the US population urbanised. So the rural votes tend to be marginalised, and that was a process which, and I read a book in that about 2012 about the rise of urban influence and the end of the nation state. And it's what's happening is that the rebellion of people who actually remember that you need a balanced nation state to provide food, resources, manpower, and a balanced thinking. I mean, you can't rely on this globalist supply chain forever, because inevitably that doesn't work. This is the old Australian philosophy, which was alive and well from the 1980s and later, about the post-industrial society. That we'll in another 10 years we won't have to work. We'll just the government will pay us, and we'll be able to spend our time on pleasurable things or intellectual pursuits or going to the beach. Well, this is utopianist in the extreme, but the Australians still believe that science and technology and being rich and so on are going to take care of everything. And if we want something, we just buy it. Begs the question of buy it with what? Because what you have with a society which ceases to be productive is questionable control over the value of your currency. And, when you think about it, it's only 2011 that the Australian dollar was up to $1.10 to the US dollar. In other words, $1.10 US to buy $1 Australian dollar. Now, a US dollar, will buy an Australian dollar is only worth 68 cents US. So it's more than a 40% drop in our buying power, and that's without looking at inflation. You can't, because essentially the post-industrial idea which the US and Canada and Western Europe and Australia bought into, Australia being the leading state in this, means that you buy everything from abroad, and so you're giving your currency for their goods, and that works until you run out of cash or the cash runs out of value, and that's what happens. You can keep printing the money, but if nobody wants it, you're Zimbabwe. And when I said to Rio Tinto's managing director, who said, when I asked why you don't do value adding to the iron ore going out of Australia, he said, that doesn't work. I said, oh, so the Chinese can add value to Australian iron ore, but we can't. He said, yeah, that's right. I said, this is crazy. In the old days, BHP, who now has this same approach, but in the old days, BHP was vertically integrated and were building, a big one of the sponsors of Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, building Mirage fighters, including the Atar engines and the like, and we were building all of that. Now we can't do it. And what happens is you eventually transfer so much of your money, and the supplier states, the poor people who actually got dirty in the satanic mills, all of a sudden have all your money, and they become the new wealthy, and we become the new poor. Because sooner or later it has to happen. It's just literally transferring all of your assets, or all of your cash, and influence for consumables, essentially, is what it means. So we end up with no manufacturing capability and the like, and that's where we are today. It's okay. You can say we've got this great, IT industry and the like, and artificial intelligence. Everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, but artificial intelligence, like quantum computing, depends on the supply of electricity. If you can't supply your electricity, and California is now going through brownouts on a regular basis because they've abandoned all sense of what it takes to run a balanced economy. So if you have no electricity, you have no quantum computing. It's as simple as that. So we're now going through this ridiculous phase of thinking we can do it all in this elegant, clean fashion of renewables and so on. We don't have to get our hands dirty.
All right.
Mr. Adam Bant,
Oh yes, Adam
leader
Ant.
of that push.
Adam Ant.
Oh.
Yes.
Another question. Last time you had come back from Fiji. Been things happening out in the Pacific in the last week or so.
Yep.
What's the story about the Pacific Association?
The Pacific Islands Forum was just, of course, in Nuku'alofa with our gallant Prime Minister offering
his coloured shirt.
And his massaging hands.
Yeah, and yes, and I know Sidi Ramboka very well, and I think he's saying that son of a bitch. Although Sidi doesn't swear, so he wouldn't have said that. But there's lack of trust of Australia, and this policing effort and police training. It's like saying, fine. Do you like another ice cream? It's meaningless. Just the same as the offer, which is being fulfilled of, firstly, the old Pacific Forum patrol boats, and now the newer class of Guardian class patrol boats, absolutely useless in the Pacific Island conditions. They would not ask the islanders what they wanted.
I was going to say, what do you want?
And they find them useless, and they're too expensive to run. They carry 14 crew and a pop gun, no good in disaster relief whatsoever, so they never leave the dock, and one of them was just lost recently in one of the countries. But it looks good on handover day, but it doesn't do anything. And the government here has been consistently advised that they should be offering things which are going to actually help on a broad range of issues, and including what they need is these much larger but much cheaper vessels, like stern landing vessels, that they can actually drop their rear landing ramp, not a bow landing ramp, onto a beach anywhere in the Pacific Islands, and drop off supplies, pick up people and the like. And now the suggestion is that these vessels, which are designed in Queensland actually, and they are serving up there on a commercial basis, be equipped with MMRs, micro modular reactors. So you can actually not only provide relief, you can plug them in and you've regenerated the power supply, or when they're based in Suva or Nuku'alofa or whatever, they can be providing power year round. And these are leased micro modular reactors, size of this.
Nuclear.
Yeah. And they're leased by GE, and there's no worry about waste disposal, because when 5 years or 10 years, when it's time for renewal, take them out, they put in a new one, and they goes back to the US for recycling. So it's really a great benefit, and the US government is not thinking about that. But here's who is thinking about it: it's the US Marine Corps. The US Marine Corps has now signed a lease for one of these vessels, not without the reactor, but with a diesel or electric engines, and they've signed this up for the new Marine Corps strategy to have relatively high speed, long range supply vessels or assault vessels to take troops 1,000 or more miles and put them on islands in the South Pacific and the South China Seas and the like. So that Australian design has been sold to the US Marine Corps, which is probably going to get 30 or 40 of these vessels, and they can get 30 or 40 of them for the price of one or two of the vessels being offered by the British design companies and so on, which are all offering bow ramp, World War II type designs, which can go only 5 knots compared to 18 to 20 knots on the other one. 5 knots and a very ill crew over 20 miles, let alone over 1,000 nautical miles. So, and the Australian Army is not picking up on this for its assault craft either. So we are seeing most defence procurement governed by Luddites. The approach to the Pacific Islands is at the point where Australia and New Zealand are being laughed at, and one of the things that the New Zealanders have, which is slightly more in their advantage, is they've got Winston Peters, the Deputy Prime Minister, who's also Foreign Minister, who's also part Maori, and he basically knows how to talk to the islanders, but Canberra's not listening to them, doesn't understand them, and thinks we are the rich white fellas who are going to give the natives, a nice handout, and wouldn't this look good under your Christmas tree this year? And then I raised this again with Rio and BHP people about this business of Australia not adding anything to their products here. I said, you're just like Nigeria. And they said, what do you mean we're like Nigeria? I said, well, you dig it and sell it. That's it, Anybody can do that. They said, we're nothing like Nigerians. I said, how are you not like the Nigerians? Oh, that's right. The Nigerians are now building industry to add value to their iron ore and other products. Domestically, they're building with indigenous money. They're building new oil refineries because everything. They realise that unless they take control of their lives, they're going to get poorer and poorer, and they will get poorer and poorer for a while. But they are taking steps. Australia's taking no steps in that regard. We have City Rambuka proposed, and I mentioned this earlier this year, this Ocean of Peace concept, which sounds a little kumbaya, but basically he was proposing to extend the Pacific Island Forum concept, which includes Australia and New Zealand, to creating a geopolitical bloc which has regards its internal interests as being needing protection, and where Australia and New Zealand would obviously play a huge part, but it would be also something which would create us as an incredibly powerful bloc. It would be one of the largest geopolitical blocs in the world, and if it controlled access to fisheries and seabed resources, etc., we'd be getting somewhere. And by the way, if we look at it properly, we'd extend that to include Antarctica, which theoretically is still terra nullius, in other words, no man's land, but which Australia has some residual international authority over, the largest part of Antarctica, which we've ignored completely, to the point where the Chinese are now building their 5th research facility there, which is actually the military facilities, basically for polar guidance issues for their fractional orbital bombardment systems. So the whole of this ocean peace concept could really empower us in a world in which these old things like the Antarctic Treaty are falling apart, because the United Nations is falling apart, and that's Antarctic Treaty was part of that situation. So we have to be prepared for this, and we are doing nothing about it except thinking that, you know, we're going to increase our strategic dependency on the United States, particularly with the Virginia-class submarines, where we will, these submarines will turn up, the Virginia-class ones will turn up in the RAN fleet 10 to 20 years after the potential confrontation with China, by which stage we'll also have the new AUKUS-class ones being built in Australia. So I think what we're going to have to do is to save the budget and save the defence balance, is to get rid of the order for the Virginia class, proceed with the AUKUS Plus class, continue to service the British Astute and Virginia class in Stirling, but basically start to behave as though we understood the global context and how you balance budgets and how you create a national grand strategy.
Okay.
Is it true that the Trump team is against the the Virginia acquisition?
No, there were 2 senators, one Democrat, one Republican, who opposed the sale and the lease of the first 2 to Australia. Yeah, because of the poor state of the US submarine construction industry. And actually, the guy, one of my team is a Rear Admiral John Butler, who helped get the Australian Collins class going with US sensors. He said, yeah, the US submarine capacity has declined, submarine construction capacity has declined through neglect, bad management. They haven't kept their training skills levels up and so on. So they're struggling to meet the US Navy's requirements for its Virginia and the new Virginia Plus class. And the point is that we don't actually need them. We should have got into SSNs 20, 30 years ago, but of course we didn't, because nuclear was in the title. We should still do that, because there's going to be a role, almost certainly in 20, 30 years time, for nuclear submarines, but that'll be post-China, and the target then will be essentially India, Russia, Indonesia possibly, but even by that stage we'll be looking at unmanned underwater vehicles as the primary force projection capability in the anti-shipping realm.
Missiles and drones.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it fair to say that my interpretation through the media is that our sudden interest in the Pacific Islands is too little, too late and wrong-headed? And you're saying the Pacific Islanders aren't buying it. They're aware that it's driven by an agenda that's somewhat selfish, and it's not solving any of their problems. That's the read I get through the media. Is that an accurate read of what's going on?
That is an accurate read. It's a defensive mechanism against the PRC, and the US and Australia are working on that to the extent that they have the capacity, and the Americans have helped push Australia into the lead. The US is doing a lot. They're building new embassies throughout the South Pacific. They've given Rambuka a executive jet
They're not stupid.
Yeah. Well, and run book. I said, yeah, this is what President Biden gave me. And I said, so President Biden gave you, yeah. I said, was it from what, from a presidential fleet? Oh, I never thought about that. I said, it came from Langley. So it's a CIA aircraft, and
It's very heavy.
and I said the crew are CIA because there's a permanent US crew on it, and I said they will be monitoring all conversations on board when you're taking your fellow Pacific Islanders around. They said, and that's that. I said, that's the least of your problems, and if you know that, you know, Americans are your friends, you can, that's fine. The Chinese know it. The Chinese support Frank Bainimarama, who was the last Prime Minister, who's tried to use draconian methods to stay as Prime Minister of Fiji. I said, do you think that they're not going to redouble their efforts to back him to take back power in Fiji in the next elections, because it's a tenuous political situation? The next morning he came and said, I stayed awake all night thinking about that. So he arrested Frank Bainimarama on charges which were absolutely valid for Frank's misuse of power. But you've got that situation applying. But the Chinese are pushing as far as they can, but they have now run out of cash. The Belt and Road Initiative is finished. They have no real cash to put in that. They ran out of that in about 2015. They've been trying to get their cash back from these investments. So they make pocket investments here and there, and bribing officials is the cheapest way of doing that rather than mass investment. And that's what they've done, of course, not only with Sogavare, the Prime Minister of the Solomons, but his successor as well. But it's not enough to give them a lot of traction. So they bluster again and they try to counter, and yet, despite that, at Nuku'alofa, the Taiwanese Republic of China had an observer mission at the Pacific Island Forum's talks, and Beijing was not able to do anything about that. So it's, you know, there are a lot of ways this could go, and Australia and New Zealand could take back leadership if they were at least a little less bureaucratic and pompous about the way they did business in the region. China is fighting a rearguard action, but is looking now. It's looking beyond the first island chain for defence, which was normally the thing to get Taiwan from basically Japan through the first island chain, which include the Diaotai Islands down to Taiwan, Philippines, and down to Borneo. Now they're looking at the second island chain, which includes Guam. So there would not be a single operation. If they launched anything, they would launch against Guam. So how you prepare to survive a first strike there is the question of whether it will be more than just a first strike, but that will also include hits on Yokosuka in Japan as well, so the first island chain comes down from essentially Yokosuka or Tokyo down through the first island chain and down through the second island chain to New Guinea. The question is whether they'll fall apart before they can even think of doing anything. Now, if they do, you'll see a major resurgence of Russian exertion of influence out through Vladivostok and into the Sea of Okhotsk, and they still have to resolve their issues with Japan, because as far as they're concerned, World War II has not ended. There's going to be no peace treaty between Japan and the Soviet Union, or now Russia, to end that war. They had those negotiations underway until just recently, but that would involve, as far as the Japanese are concerned, removing some Russian presence in the Kuril Islands to the north of Japan, and the Russians aren't prepared to do that. So that situation moved. But then there was going to be the new Belt and Road Initiative, if you like, which would have been from the northern Japanese mainland by bridge across to Sakhalin Island, and from Sakhalin over to the mainland, and then straight across to Europe. And that's the next stage, which could happen if we see the collapse of the PRC. and the sanctions then coming off Russia, because Russia will be normalised in the situation. In the meantime, Russia has now won the great game, which was involved in Central Asia with the British until the early 20th century. Now the Russians have got the international north-south transport corridor, which goes from St. Petersburg, which essentially gives them access to the Baltic and Atlantic, but also up through the White Sea to the Arctic Ocean and the northern route there, but down the River Ring system through to Astrakhan and the Caspian, and then down to Iran, or through Azerbaijan to Iran, down to Bandar Abbas in the Arabian Sea, and over to Mumbai. So this is now, Russia has its toes in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, and there will be a naval base in that region around Bandar Abbas or Shah Bahar, I would say, very, very soon. So India and Russia are becoming much more strategically interdependent than India with the United States, for example.
All right. Well, that's pretty broad coverage.
Vulnerability of Australia with fuel, in as much as we've got 2 refineries. As I understand it, 80% of our fuel comes from Singapore and a bit from South Korea. And I understand further we've got about 3 weeks sitting supply. Valid figures, give or take?
Absolutely. And it's an intolerable situation.
Very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And where are our strategic reserves?
They're buried.
They don't exist.
They're buried in the shale of South Australia, which we won't exploit. Like the United States, we could become major oil and gas exporter and be independent. Certainly, we're not going to get any traction with the so-called renewables, which are very unreliable in terms of long-term supply and unreliable in terms of costs.
Yeah.
If we're going to be viable in anything, we have to be cheap in our energy costs. Otherwise, manufacturing here becomes prohibitive, and we might as well just keep doling out cash to.
Greg, the car industry, how much of the car industry worldwide comes from China?
A fair amount, and give you an idea of, well, you don't see a lot of Chinese vehicles, by the way, in North America at all. I mean, you come down here and you're staggered by the amount of Chinese vehicles. The car with the most US content in North America at the moment is the Honda, more than the GM cars and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it gives you an idea as to how decentralised it is. The South Koreans are, in fact, they're really sort of slipping in as major default suppliers of even US brands. And you go into Central Asia, you see lots of Chevys. That's all South Korean stuff.
Just to answer your question there, Peter, with the machinery side of things, even Caterpillar are made in China. A lot of Caterpillar machines are made in China. XCMG, that's a company that we've just done a deal with. They were building Caterpillar gear for 13 years, and now which they're going out and they've got now XCMG, which is a massive earth moving company. So there's a lot of gear made in China that we don't even realise.
Yeah, and yet that's starting to be shifted by a lot of people. I mean, people are moving their production bases out of China just because of the instability there at the moment. You look at the reduction of iron ore purchases by the PRC, and Rio and BHP have all said, oh no, that'll be going on for 50, 100 years from Australia. Already cutting back dramatically. We're seeing a $3 billion reduction in royalties to the state government here in the next year or so because of the reduction of imports of iron ore by the PRC. I mean, I agree with you that there are all of these bits and pieces. In one of my companies in the UK, we were doing huge amounts of stuff for Caterpillar and JCB. It was a shipbuilding company, but we did all these heavy metal bits, and that's all disappeared now because lowest bid wins.
Yeah. But it is, I've been there twice in the last 12 months, and you don't, on the surface, you wouldn't believe that it was a country that's struggling, because all the motorbikes are all electric, all the cars are all electric, all the trains are doing 300 kilometres an hour, and they're all electric. There's no graffiti, there's flowers all along the roads. It's just an unbelievable city. Even in Zhou, not just Shanghai, but there's a lot going on, and you wouldn't believe that there are. The only place I saw it, we did a lot of factory tours there, and at 4:30 in the afternoon, generally earth moving machinery, factories, they're working, around the clock, 24/7. But it was surprising to see, and I actually asked the question, where is everybody at 4:30? Everybody's gone home.
Yeah.
And that was only one shift that they're working.
Yeah. And that's in the companies that have got longish term commitments, and they're desperately trying to hold on to them. We're getting messages from Chinese companies every day offering, please give us any work on anything. Whatever you need, we'll get it.
Yeah, but still, just on the surface, it all looks really rosy.
Yeah, and until you go look at downtown Shanghai shopping areas, all empty.
Yeah, I didn't see that. I saw a lot of people buying Gucci bags, and the shops are still full. And
A couple of the foreigners, though.
I did. One thing that did. I noticed we had an entourage of Chinese that were with us.
Yeah.
To watch over us, and after a few days.
Yeah.
I asked a couple of them, and there was about 20 that followed us around for probably 4 or 5 days.
Yeah.
And I asked a couple of them that didn't seem to be involved too much. I said, how do you guys fit in on this? They said, we put money into the islands around Australia. I said, okay. I didn't ask them any more questions, but there was a whole lot of government people just watching and observing.
Yeah, no question. It's interesting that Xi Jinping, though, has got most of his family in the US or Australia.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not plugging them. I'm just,
No.
just giving you what I observed.
No, and they're very careful about what they show you these days.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And even the fact that we couldn't spend the Chinese money there, their cash. I cashed something if I went there. I couldn't spend any of it.
Really?
You couldn't use your credit card there. So it's very controlled.
Yeah.
But what is the significance of the BRICS group of countries?
Yeah.
I understand India, China. I don't understand Brazil. I understand South Africa, but how does that work together?
Well, it really doesn't. I mean, the BRICS concept was created by Wall Street when they were looking for offshore areas where they thought in the 80s and 90s they thought would be good areas of foreign invest abroad, because Americans were looking to get some foreign investments. And when you think about it, Russia and China are mutual antagonists. They hate each other. South Africa is essentially, again, bankrupt there, and it's getting worse by the day. They were saved by this coalition government, I think, in the last few months. So you've got a situation with countries that actually didn't have any real connection with each other, but they were created as this investment zone by Wall Street, which that went to nothing. And so now the Chinese and the Russians both thought that they could exploit this. And this was greatly assisted by the United States when it started doing sanctions against individual political and industrial and military leaders in various countries around the world, particularly China and Russia, and particularly post February 2022 with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The US used the sanctions weapon as they had done in the past, and never learned the lessons of the fact that sanctions always backfire. They tend to punish the sanctioning power, like the United States, more than they do the target countries. South Africa and Zimbabwe, of course, in the early days, the whole defence industry and energy industries mobilised because they couldn't get oil and gas and so on through other means. So you had Sasol and those other things, but the defence industries. And the same thing with Chile. The Chileans under Pinochet, the head of the defence industries there, a chap called Carlos Coduen, had a picture of Jimmy Carter on his wall saying, Jimmy Carter, father of the Chilean defence industry, because it forced them to create that. And what we've seen is, though, with the sanctions, is leaders saying, well, the rationale for seizing Russian oligarchs' yachts and so on and punishing them and seizing their property unilaterally was that they, under US law, they're dealt in US dollars to buy some of these products. And by using US dollars, you are then, according to Washington, subject to US law. Well, so a lot of the BRICS leaders, particularly Lula da Silva in Brazil, saying, well, I just won't buy anything in US dollars. We won't deal with US dollars. Then we can't be touched. And it's backfiring. This is the undermining of the prestige of the US dollar began literally because of this overuse of sanctions and this overconfidence of the United States that the dollar could never wane because there was no replacement global currency. And to a degree that's true. The BRICS currencies, even if they do create a common currency, which I doubt will happen, or if it does, it'll be a tokenist thing, because it won't have any centre, like the euro doesn't have any commitment of underlying asset value or prestige. But it does show the weakening of the US dollar, but not the strengthening of particularly the yuan, for example, which is, yes, the Iranians are using it, and the Saudis are using it, UAE's, I think, using it for some sales, but they're only using it because they can use it as in lieu of barter. They're going to buy back stuff from the PRC with the yuan that they've got for that oil, but not because they have faith in it. And in fact, the new Iranian president has basically threatened Beijing, saying you promised $400 billion in investment over 10 years, and that was 5 years ago. When are we going to see the start of this? And our relationship with you will depend on, seeing some performance, and that's not going to happen. So even though BRICS has expanded and is including a lot more countries, it's going to be tokenism. In fact, not that doesn't have some strategic value. We looked at the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement of Eurasian states, and that had a mutual defence treaty as part of it, and it really didn't mean anything because nobody was serious about coming to the aid of any of their partners. But occasionally they can use that to do deals, but they haven't come up with a strategic mechanism yet, like BRICS or like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to replace that. And the same with us when we created AUKUS, which theoretically could be the most important strategic alliance in the world because it's the only one that covers all the oceans, North and South Atlantic, North and South Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the polar regions, with a combined force which is unmatched in terms of US, Australia, UK, and with the land access which all have got on those oceans, including the British and the Mediterranean and the like. And yet we're treating it as though it's somehow just a way that we can buy nuclear propulsion technology or do some other technology deals, when really it's a much greater thing, and Australia is still subordinating itself to the others. But there are these treaties depend on who's around to make them work, and so BRICS could turn into something doubtful, but it could. SCO could turn into something. AUKUS could turn into something. But we're not. Look at the three US, Australian, UK leaders. Would you trust them to form a committee?
Which one in America? The current or the future?
Well, I tell you, we'd be a lot better off if Trump comes in, because he's actually pro-Australia, pro-AUKUS, and pro-British. And I can tell you, Kamala Harris and Biden, both very anti-British, very, very, very anti-British.
Well, it is
Sorry,
now
George,
2:30
one last-
and
one last one.
last one.
Microchips. Taiwanese produce the majority of them in the world, and they've got another factory coming in the States. Is there any future in other words, are we going to continue with a shortage of microchips, or will the world?
Well, as long as Taiwan can keep producing, we're good. The PRC definitely has plans to, as part of its operation against Taiwan, would be to neutralise that immediately. The Taiwanese have invested the money to build those 2 big factories in Arizona, neither of which is in operation at this stage because they can't hire anybody. Yeah.
I was just by chance in Taiwan about 2 months ago, and an aircraft taxied past us with $500 million worth of chip manufacturing equipment. Not chips, and it went to the US.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's happening.
What
Oh, yeah.
export was it?
I have one question.
Chip
I'm going to be
manufacturing
naughty.
equipment.
Any?
Last time you were here, you said that Ukraine cannot possibly win the war.
Correct.
What do you think now?
Correct.
Sustain it?
They'll keep it going through the end of this year, which is about this is what Zelensky's move into the Kursk salient was all about. It's a distraction which is going to cost him the war ultimately, but it gives him some bargaining chips because of prisoner exchanges and so on. That's what he's looking for now, is a negotiating position. And as you noticed, when the Biden-Trump debate took place, the next day he called Xi Jinping and asked Xi to start organising some kind of settlement talks. He then rallied a bit when Biden was pulled out of the race and Kamala came in, and he started to think, well, maybe if Kamala comes in, we'll keep getting US support. That's not realistic. The US support is declining already. British support under Labour is going down. Polish-German support's finished. They don't have the manpower resources, they don't have the equipment resources. They can do some interesting things, but at the end of the day, you're seeing what was, in the recent definition of Ukraine, the eastern Ukraine from maybe Kharkiv down to through the Donbass down to the Crimea, going to Russia. Now, to what extent Zelensky can save some element of that is depending on how good these negotiating instruments he's got. I mean, if things go pear-shaped or stop, then the Russians just escort them out of Kursk, the Kursk salient, because there's no way they can hold it. And there was never a way that they could hold it and do anything. It was a soft target and very important politically and in terms of psychology, but that was always a negotiating position. And you have to bear in mind that if Zelensky is involved in the negotiation, his sole concern is for his safety and his family's safety. He has to find somewhere where he can go, because the generals will kill him in Ukraine. They are very angry at him for mismanaging that whole operation. And they've told me that, several of them have told me that directly. We'll deal with him as soon as there's a peace settlement. We can't deal with him while there's a war underway. And as soon as this is settled, he gets taken into account.
So he's aware that if Trump gets in and Trump says he'll fix it all up in 3 weeks, that he's going to take a vetoed vote to keep them out of NATO. That'll happen. And then Russia will keep some of the terrain it's gained. And that'll stop it.
Well, yeah, it'll keep all of the terrain it's gained, because that was all Russian territory originally. Yes. So there's no way they're going to settle for less. They need control of the Sea of Azov, which cuts off a vital area of even grain exports from Western Ukraine. But it also means that the traditional manufacturing areas, heavy industry areas up into Kharkiv, or Kharkov, will go back to Russian hands.
Yep, makes sense.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Greg. I think you've been most informative. Any questions?
I was going to take a radical change, if I may, Greg.
Yeah.
The Islamisation of the world that is appears to be continuing apace now. I was involved with a charter airline that had 3 747s ready to go 24/7, 52 weeks a year, to fly all of the Muslims out of the Netherlands. This was back in the late 90s. The UNHCR rose the prospect that this was against human relations, and the case was fought in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and they overturned the Dutch designs by threatening Holland with excommunication and expungement from the EC, European Union, which would have killed Holland and her trading prospects. So the contract was cancelled. Now Europe is running into a huge Islamisation problem.
Yeah.
Where are we going with this, Greg? Have you got any?
Well, the Danes, the Swedes and the Dutch are now fairly united in their attempts to remove Muslim societies. The Swedes have actually got rid of a huge number, and so have the Danes. And I think what the new Dutch government is actually
repatriating back to where they're from.
Yeah, and actually destroying the mosques as well.
Oh wow! Wow.
Yeah, so that's significant. Now, what we haven't seen the backlash yet, but if we see the continued rise in power of von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, she'll put up some resistance to that, I think. But basically, none of the others are in a position to voice much opposition. I mean, you've got huge blocks of the EU now anti-Brussels, Hungary particularly, but also Italy particularly, Poland. Poland not so much. They've now backed off a bit, but even Greece and Cyprus are starting to get antagonistic, and we're seeing a turn to conservatism in Portugal and Spain as well. The unfortunate thing is with the new UK government, which really there's less of a mandate actually than Albanese has here, yet they're basically looking to reaccommodate with the EU, which is disastrous. It's like the whole world, one step forward, 2 steps backwards. We were happy with it, 2 steps forward and 1 step backward before. Now it's been reversed.
Well, they're nationalising the rail again in the UK, so we're going to have national rail strikes every Christmas and Easter.
Yeah, exactly.
Guaranteed.
Yeah, guaranteed.
Oh, thank you, Greg. Neil, would you like to say a few words?
No, I'm fine. With Taiwan, do you think they're capable of defending themselves without America?
Well, are we capable of defending ourselves without the United States? And the answer to that is no. Taiwan is actually better equipped to defend itself than we are. Having said that, it's a different circumstance and a shorter range set of operations. The ROC Taiwan has got now an increasingly effective anti-ship capability, which means that if you have an amphibious lift against Taiwan, which would be very difficult to prosecute because there are only like 3 beach areas that they could land on, so they're all well defended from the ground. They've also got submarine and surface-based anti-ship capabilities, which are very good. They've also, and the PLA Air Force was going to be the launch for with the new Y-20s, with them basically threatening to drop 200,000 paratroops. Now, at least 50% of those aircraft would not make it across the straits. But even so, it's a questionable thing. So they would lose at least half of their sea lift, at least half of their airlift, and it would be very, very difficult. Now, the thing is that regardless of whether the US is involved, Japan would be involved, because they've already committed.
Because Taiwan is actually part of Japan.
No, they occupied it. No, they occupied it for a brief period. Yeah. I mean, the Portuguese and Dutch occupied it for much longer. That's Formosa. But the Diaoyutai Islands or the Diaoyu Islands, as the PRC calls them. Diaoyu is what the Taiwanese call them, and the Japanese call them something else, Senkakus. They are the debatable islands. They're all part of the Taiwanese geological chain, which is separate from the Japanese island chain.
Their archipelago.
Yeah. So, and the Japanese have even acknowledged that the Diaoyu Islands were geographically part of Taiwan. So there's no disharmony at all between Taipei and Tokyo. Spent a lot of time with both of them.
All right, last question.
Oh.
Your favourite girlfriend?
So I do.
Come out.
Yeah, my favourite girl. But I liked
got
it.
time?
I liked her when she was Indian. Now that she's black, I'm not so sure.
How do we find your? You've got a website to get a book, and
Yeah, it's strategicstudies.org.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Greg. Thank you for the time. And I'd like to thank you for coming. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks, guys, for
Yeah.
showing
Thank you.
up.
Thanks, Greg.
For more Jeremiads of gloom and doom.
Very interesting.